Hello everybody, welcome to episode 8 of AJTV. I'm AJ Sacher, and today we're going to talk about a match from Pro Tour Barcelona between Osyp and LSV. This is from the limited portion, and I want to talk about two things, one from each side of the table. For Osyp, I want to talk about autopilot, what it is, how to spot it, how to avoid it. And from LSV's side, I want to talk about how to find a win when it seems like there isn't one to find. LSV ends up winning this game, and he does so thanks to a couple misplays by Osyp and LSV really maximizing his cards and knowing how best to eke out a win when at a disadvantage. The disadvantage being that he mulliganed a 5 this game. So, I'm probably not going to be able to go over every aspect of either of these topics, really, of autopiloting or of how to win off of, a multi 5. But hopefully we can touch on some ideas, and then either you can expound upon them yourself, or I will write more articles and do more videos on similar topics. So, this is game 3, and Luis is on the draw. And what really drew me to this game in particular was I was watching the Pro Tour coverage live, and the thing that stood out about this match was the commentating. I actually think that the commentators did a great job all weekend, and the production value of the cut to my face here. Production value of the coverage was awesome, and having the revolutionary way that they had the news desk and then the caster's desk, so they were able to stay live and not be just having to kill dead air, but were able to play pre-recorded videos or cut to the news desk and have people talk about the what's it called, the World Magic Cup points race and all that good stuff. But this match, the commentating is painful. I don't know. It was as if the commentators had given up on Luis before the game even began, and they're just talking about every time Osyp plays a card. It seems like every time Osyp plays anything, the commentators were saying, "Oh, this is the nail in the coffin," and every time Luis would play something, they're like, "Oh, well, it's probably not." That's good, but it's not going to be enough to pull him out. And it was so bad that they were talking about other matches during the most important turns of this game. And at the end of the game, it got to the point where the game ended, they shook hands, and the commentators thought that Osyp had won when Luis had won. So it was awkward to watch, but I was I'm pretty sure that game was one of the better games of the tournament from a spectator perspective, and I rewatched it after, and sure enough the game is awesome and there's a lot of cool stuff to talk about, so let's do that. So Luis plays his blood killer guy and has his death touch peddler and doesn't link them up, which is pretty basic, but you'll see a decent number of people link it up just to try and trade with one of their guys. And Osyp has a sort of slow draw, but now he's got a 4/5 and a 4/4, both with shroud or hexproof. So Luis misses his land drop. And this is about the point where the commentators were resigning on Luis's behalf. But what we're going to see is Luis sequencing his cards in a way that will give him the greatest chance to pull off a miracle. Because what he needs is a miracle. After missing multiple land drops and, you know, being on down 2 cards and being attacked by pretty scary force. Here he death wins the 3/3, drains him for 1, and then attacks him for 1. There's a little life total discrepancy here, but one thing that is really important to keep your eye on this game is the Blood Artist. He really pulls a lot of weight and allows Luis some breathing room to sort of manipulate the game state in a way to like give himself the most amount of time and the highest likelihood of racing. I don't think that Luis at any point thought that he was going to be able to grind Osyp out, being down cards so early and, you know, facing down giant shroudy guys. He has to find a unique way to win the game, and he ends up drawing a pretty important series of cards to allow him to do exactly that. But one of the best ways to play from a mulligan is to use a card like Blood Artist to sort of grind yourself back to even. It's going to be really hard for you to outcard your opponent, but if you can trade evenly 1 for 1 and you gain a 1 life drain each turn or each time you trade a 1 for 1, then you're not just treading water, right? You're like slightly gaining this incremental advantage where eventually you can even out the disadvantage that you started with, and then you're on even footing and can play the game normally from there. Before we analyze what happens next, I want to mention that the most common way that people win from 5 or 4 cards is by creating an unanswerable situation. What I mean by that is you're going to win more games from a mold of 5 with Invisible Stalker and an equipment than you are with, you know, 2 3s for 3. Just because you're at such a disadvantage that you need to completely go against, or you need to do something completely different than your opponent is trying to do and is prepared for you to do. And that's sort of a way to virtually balance out the card disadvantage, because by doing something unique and attacking them from an angle that is hard for them to answer, then you're essentially blanking X number of cards in their hand / deck, and you can use that to sort of make up the ground between you. But a lot of times people don't like sort of going all in, and while I agree it's kind of scary when you're both on 7 cards to sort of spend all of your mana every turn, you know, pumping 1 creature, or to sort of play to where you're like drawing to a 2-outer or something like that. When you're down cards and you're behind on board, you got to get a little scrappy. You got to sort of find a path to victory, even if it's not intuitive, not what your deck really originally wanted to do, or even if you're going to get blown out. Like, if he has one of his 4 removal spells here, then I get 3 for 1 and double time walked. It's like, yeah, but you're going to lose the game, so you might as well cross the fingers and go for it. And a lot of people that are sort of at the PTQ, upper PTQ level, are at the point where they know that it's not always good to risk or put a bunch of resources at risk to, you know, get 2 for 1 or whatever, but aren't able to sort of separate that in their mind from the situations when it's actually correct, because either you get blown out or you win, versus you're not going to get blown out, but you're just going to lose. You're playing to survive instead of playing to win. You're playing to barely lose instead of lose in ridiculous fashion or win. So let's look at this, which is the game state from Osyp's point of view. Now, what ends up happening is Osyp sends all three of these creatures, and Luis blocks as such. These two are married. What Osyp does next is Terrifying Presence on the Druid's Familiar. The end result of this combat is this dies and Luis drains for 1. From such an advantageous position, him at 1 life having to block, and you having this super powerful combat trick, there's got to be a way to manipulate this to get more of an advantage. This is where the autopilot comes in from Osyp. And I definitely am not trying to say that Osyp is bad, because he is incredibly good. This is just very basic autopilot. He had a good enough draw, a strong board. His opponent was on 5 cards and missed land drops. What Osyp did, I assume, is he had this combat trick in his hand, and he equated it, combat trick, that's, advantageous. But he didn't actually set up, this is a very specific combat trick. This isn't just your run-of-the-mill giant growth. This takes, Terrifying Presence takes a little more setting up. And so he's just like, my squad's better than his, and I have this, combat trick in case anything goes wrong. Send all my guys. And then Luis blocks like this, and Osyp snap puts down the Terrifying Presence, and then actually has to think about what he's targeting, because it's not clear what end result of combat is best for him. In the chat, a lot of people on the Twitch chat, people were saying that he should just not cast Terrifying Presence, which then you're trading your Familiar and your Bird for all 3 of his guys, and he's draining you for 5, and you're left with a shield mate, and then you can play whatever you want. I don't think that's the best route to take. I think with the opponent at 1 life, you can attack with just these 2, and Luis is obligated to block, likely like this, unless he's really smart and knows that he has to leave the death touch for the Familiar, or he's pretty much never going to beat it. So if he blocks like this, which I imagine would be the correct block, then instead of losing our Druid's Familiar and just having 2 shield mates, we trade our Bird for his Flying Guy and his Blood Cultist, or Blood Artist. We take 3, and then we play, where is it? This thing. And, further our board. If Luis does block like this, then we're trading these 2 for these 2. He drains for 4, and then we play our other shield mate, equip it to this thing, and we have the same game state we had before. We have a 4/4 and a 4/5, both with hexproof, and we're facing down a Blood Artist and a guy at 5 life. So both of those are pretty advantageous. The other option is to attack with both, or just the Bird and then Terrifying Presence to keep the flyer around. The only reason you would want to do that is to then play Triumph, which I think is a reasonable line. I think that Osyp was a little too excited to get Triumph on the board. I actually would prefer creating a game state where advancing my board is more advantageous, because he's on such a clock that we're giving him really little time to pull out of this position. Whereas if we play Triumph and try and draw a few cards, then, like, yeah, we might draw a card or two, but we're already up a ton of cards. And we're already in this super advantageous position. So why not just further your board and, like, get him dead instead of, like, drawing some cards and seeing what happens. So I prefer attacking with these two and then playing either the Ghoul or the Shieldmate, depending on how Luis blocks, rather than the alternative, which is attack with these two, or just the bird, Terrifying Presence, and then Triumph. So, this happens. There's this awkward moment where he Terrifying Presence, drew Familiar, then it's like, And again, trust me, Osyp is not bad magic. He's actually quite good, but this is what happens when you sort of autopilot and when you create mental shortcuts in your head, right? Like, my board is better than his board, so it's profitable to attack. And this is a combat trick, so it's okay to put myself in a situation where combat could get scary, because having a combat trick is an advantage. But those mental shortcuts don't account for how your specific creatures match up just because your guys are better. The creatures still match up in a way that's not too bad for Luis in a one-on-one fight, and because he gets to choose the blockers, because that's the way Magic works. And the combat trick is very specific in the way that it works, and sort of shortcutting combat trick makes combat more advantageous for me. Can get you in some awkward situations where you aren't really utilizing your creatures or your combat trick. So there's the Triumph. Luis is relieved it's not another creature. And here's actually a pretty cool play that I thought was way cooler at the time, but once I rewatched the video, it's actually like pretty intuitive. But in the moment, I messed it up, and so I imagine other people would as well. Sorry if my voice is bad. I have a bit of a sore throat. Everyone's getting sick around me, and it's making me sick. So Luis plays a Druid's Familiar here, and he puts it on his flyer, the 4/1, the bats. Now, my initial reaction was like, he can put it on the Blood Artist, and then finally the Blood Artist can actually do something. But the truth is, it can't. Facing down a 4/5 and a 4/4. If Osyp attacks with just the 4/5, then Luis is likely to chump it rather than double, even if he pumped his Blood Artist, because the Druid's Familiar is too important. If Osyp attacks with the Druid's Familiar, then Luis is going to try and trade away his Druid's Familiar for it. So it doesn't matter that the artist was pumped, because a 2/3 still gets eaten by this 4/5. By pumping the bat, he is creating basically a no-loss situation for him. He's sacrificing very, very little. I can't even think of like what Osyp could have, or Luis could be representing that would would be sacrificing some percentage on. So at very little cost here, he's denying Osyp an entire card off of his Triumph, which, even though it's not logical, actually almost feels like a 2-for-1, right? Because you're denying him a card off the top of his deck, and you're making the Triumph worthless, which is a good feeling. Get a good shot of Osyp's sleeve. Now here's a situation where having the Terrifying Presence would have been a lot better, because our attack is only attack with that. And we could have Terrifying Presenced. Why Osyp didn't attack with his 4-5, I don't know. But now Osyp holds up his counter, Geist Snatch. But Luis has a timely miracle. Sweet bracelet. I mean, wristband, of course. So he thinks about how he's going to distribute his counters. It's the +4/+1/+1 counters miracle, which is not only awesome because it lets him outclass Osyp's creatures, but it also turns off the Triumph, and it also time walks Osyp because he was hoping to Geist Snatch a creature. So, very timely miracle from Luis, but things like that have to happen for you to win off of 5 cards. Luis plays his worm and it gets Geist Snatched. Another big factor of why Luis was able to come back in this game is Osyp had a Craterhoof Behemoth in his hand pretty much all game. AKA, he was basically down a card, because even a 5-card hand is going to kill you before that thing hits the board unless you're really defensive. And Osyp has cards like Double Scrap Skin Drake and some other like offensive cards that don't really play well. Let me pause it. Don't really play well with the Craterhoof Behemoth. Like, they don't buy you the time you need to Behemoth them. Behemoth is still like good enough, likely good enough to play anyway, and it's very possible that the only cards we saw out of Osyp's deck, like that he had more defensive cards, he just didn't draw them. But for all intents and purposes of this game, the Craterhoof Behemoth was basically a mulligan. So then he's like down a card, and he's on the play while Luis is on the draw, and all of a sudden it's like getting into the range of, you know, maybe having to go to Paris twice isn't actually that devastating. This attack, I feel like, and the commentators nailed this one, is one of the most critical points in the game. At only 3 life, facing down 4/5, 4/4, and 2 flyers, Luis sends. I know that there are a lot of people who, maybe not in this particular situation because it's, you know, an 8/8 and Luis is dead in 2 to the Scrap Skin Drake because he's going to kill the 1/1, as we'll see in a second. But maybe this attack in particular, and this situation in particular, is spelled out enough that, you know, people would be able to figure it out. But one of the bigger mistakes that people make when they mulligan a lot or are at some other disadvantage, like being at a low life, they start to turtle up, to steal a StarCraft term, and just defend, like play really defensively and cautiously, and that's almost always going to lose you the game. Because the longer the game goes, the more pronounced your disadvantage is going to be because of the snowball effect, which I've written about before and will write about again. But the longer the game goes, it's less likely, or it's more likely to equalize, but it's just as likely that it's going to become increasingly difficult for you to win. Whereas if you are looking for small edges, like where you can actually safely attack, not even safely attack, but most likely safely attack, you know, if your attack is 70% likely to be safe, but those points will end up mattering. It's a matter of finding out let me rephrase that. It's a matter of trying to gain traction in a game rather than trying to stabilize in a game. Trying to stabilize means sort of eliminating all threats and like getting to a point of almost inevitability where, you know, you have this advantageous thing, but not only does that make it harder on you when you're down cards, but also the fact that Osyp has a Crater Hoof Behemoth makes it unlikely that Luis is going to be able to sort of grind the game out into an even state and then start to play a game from there. Instead, Luis is kind of taking it into his own hands, gaining traction by actually actively doing something to his opponent in a way that will enable him to have the possibility of a win. That got really convoluted, but I stand by it. Once again, the goal of Magic is not to lose only by the smallest amount possible or to survive for the most amount of turns, but to have the highest likelihood of winning the game. If you attack into a situation where you're dead to a removal spell and they have one of their many removal spells, it doesn't necessarily mean you messed up. Maybe you didn't have a chance in that game unless you could, unless, you know, he didn't have the removal spell. Maybe you were dead to that removal spell anyway. Maybe you could have survived longer, but it was a higher likelihood that you needed that attack to connect in order to get your opponent dead. So what happened while I was talking there was Luis played the -1/-1 that turns it into a zombie on the blue spirit token, and then drained Osyp for 1 after Osyp took 8 from the soul bonded and +4/+4 bear, which again is blanking that triumph, which not only is a card gone, but Osyp set up that turn 5 or that turn 6, I guess it was, with the intent of using all of his mana with Terrifying Presence and then Triumph, when he could have instead played a creature, which almost certainly would have meant a loss for Luis. So here Osyp thinks about his position, which, again, the commentators are like, oh, Luis is dead in 2, but that's not actually true because of Luis's Druid Familiar is in the Abyss mode. Osyp has the Trumpet, which then the Blood Artist drains him, which then puts Luis to 5, meaning the Drake isn't lethal in 2. What Osyp actually is thinking about here, I just remembered, is he's actually thinking about attacking with all of his guys rather than just the Drake. And he ends up sending them all, which just means that Luis has to chump both of them. Which the significance of which is that it's going to be harder to get Luis dead immediately, but it lets Osyp sort of chump block indefinitely, you know, like chump block for as many creatures as he has, rather than be grinded out by the Blood Artist. There's also a consideration for not only getting the Blood Artist off the board, but getting the Wolf off the board. If Osyp just attacked with the Drake and played another Drake, for example, then any pump spell, I know that there's a +2/+2 for soul bonded creatures and a +1/+1 reach. Either one of them would make the Wolf 5 power, which is not only lethal, but unblockable because of the Wolf's ability. So getting the Blood Artist off the board is important. Getting the wolf off the board is potentially important. It drops Osyp to 2, which means that Luis can play the Mind Rot that drains for 2 for lethal, which the commentators point out Luis does actually have a copy of in his deck. I'm not sure if Osyp knows, but it's a matter of whether that's more relevant or that's more likely to be relevant versus the Blood Artist and the Wolf being in play being more relevant. And by making Luis chump with them, he's also opening up next turn that those ground guys can get in again. Also, of random note, Luis had a red card in his opener that he ends the game with in his hand without a red source, which I just like pointing stuff out like that because basically he started with 4 cards and there's always hope. You just have to create situations for yourself where you can run a series of cards off to win, or your opponent can get unlucky to win, or your opponent can make a mistake to win, or your opponent can make a series of mistakes to win. Also asked about the Blood Artist trigger, which, sure enough, if the Blood Artist is chumping and dies along with combat damage, killing Luis, Luis will die with the triggers on the stack. It's not like Lifelink that it happens automatically. It does need to go onto the stack, which is what the... Ooh, Luis, give me the finger? Come on, man. Show some class. But, yeah, Luis explained that to him. The judges confirmed. Or other way around, I guess. And sure enough, Luis decides that getting things off the board, which I actually like this attack a lot. Commentators didn't like it as much, but I think I like it. As long as, you know, there's not knowledge I don't know about. He could have potentially only attacked with one of them, I guess. Like, only the Shroud guy. And then Luis has to lose one of his guys. But at that point, then Luis just loses the guy that, like, he wants the least. And losing the Wolf could actually be advantageous for him because he gets to resoul bond to something else. But that combat, that exchange, was... Even though Osyp was sort of gaining ground on board, all the trading and chumping, all the guys dying, I should say, let Luis gain enough life that after abyssing the next turn, he was no longer dead on board. And then the big finish. Osyp has a Scrap Skin Drake and plays a Lumberknot, and Luis kills the only Soul Bond guy with Human Frailty before the Soul Bond can go on the Lumberknot, meaning the Lumberknot can't fight. His only other guys in hand cost 8 and are Scapskin Drake. He could have played the Shieldmate there, but did not. And yes, he talks about it after. Like, he could have played the Shieldmate, but chose the Lumberknot. So it goes. So it goes. So some pretty cool things going on in that game. I think Osyp was autopiloting for 99% of it. even that last turn, which sadly ended up costing him. But what was really cool was watching Luis sort of dig himself out of the hole that he started in, that his deck made him start in at the beginning, with not spectacular cards. You know, he had a couple removal spells and the one miracle on the really key turn, but he was using like Blood Artist, which is a good card, but you know, it's not an invisible stalker. It's not something that's automatically gonna pull you out of or give you a free win, I should say. And yeah, he was able to sort of manipulate the board and let Osyp make his mistakes and get his traction in the game and pull out. Pretty cool. Best in the world. Alright guys, that is the end. My cluttered outro page. I'm still streaming a bunch on Twitch. Check me out, and I'll be doing a couple more videos. I think I have one more video I want to do from the Pro Tour, and then yeah, I'll be doing some more.